Welcome. This is The Story Matters. It's an effort to bring storytelling into your home. So you may watch this program and think about what storytelling means to you. We hope that the guests who are here with us during these coming months and years will become like friends for you and maybe mentors and helping you encourage telling your story and learning your story. It is exciting today to have our good friend Bryan Alexander to share this time of conversation together. Bryan, why don't you say a little bit about who you are and your background?
Greetings. Well, it's really good to be on the show, Len. It's always good to be with you. I'm a full-time writer, consultant, and futurist. I work on the future of education and technology. So I do a lot of speaking, I do a lot of writing, I do a lot of travel behind that. My background is I'm a recovering English professor. So I used to teach the novel and 18th century literature and new media studies at a small liberal arts college in Louisiana. Since then I've worked for a nonprofit that works with a few hundred small liberal arts colleges. And now I run my own business and spend a lot of time writing and talking.
Good. Let me take you back further, though, to when you were younger and ask the question, how did you first become aware of storytelling, become interested in storytelling? What were some of your early experiences there?
Well, it's funny. I mean, I grew up in the North. I was born in New York City, grew up in Long Island, and then moved to the state of Michigan. And those areas don't have a great culture of oral storytelling, and nor did my family. But I was a very shy kid, very quiet, and so I grew up reading a lot and watching TV a lot. So my sense of story was primarily text and images. So my sense of story came from Rod Serling in The Twilight Zone. It came from Ray Bradbury in The Martian Chronicles. And I was pretty shy until, really until college. And then at university, I opened up, became much more extroverted, talked a lot more, and met a lot more people from a wide range of cultures, and then became an English professor. This obviously involved lots of storytelling, but again, it's primarily based in text. I did a lot of work in multimedia, so I was always interested in storytelling by images, by comic books, by radio, but that was my main focus. Then I lived in Louisiana, and I was introduced to the whole elaborate and rich culture of Southern storytelling, where so many people are used to telling stories as part of life. In fact, I had a colleague who said he thought the strangest thing about Jimmy Carter as president was that he was the only Southerner he knew who couldn't tell a story. So I thought it was a great critique of Carter and quite a glimpse of Southern life. Then when I was working with this nonprofit, working with hundreds of small colleges, I got introduced to digital storytelling, took a workshop on that, fell in love with it, then developed my own workshop, taught digital storytelling for a bit, for about 10 years, and then ended up writing a book, which looks like this, The New Digital Storytelling from Prager. And I've been working in digital storytelling ever since.
We both were from Michigan. I didn't realize that it's kind of that Kevin Bacon.
Yes, but opposite
degrees of separation.
Opposite ends of Michigan. You're in the west side. I was in the southeast.
Just briefly, my storytelling experiences came from the family. Now, my mother told stories all the time, basically as a way to respond. She worried. I always said she was a Class A worrier. And
so the stories would be a response to what, crisis or challenge or problem?
It would come nothing was too small to be of concern and to be therefore the basis of a story. My father, on the other hand, was a quiet man, and he would retire every time it got like that to his stamp collection and his stamp business.
So he's a philatelist rather than a narratologist.
Right. So the parents were influencing storytelling, but the storytelling really came from my sisters. I have 4 sisters, 3 older, 1 younger.
Do you have any brothers?
No brothers.
Oh.
And and what we did was both be have joy together, and we got angry at each other, and feist, and we would tell. It would always end up in some story that would that we would tell, and what I was as I was thinking about this, what I thought most about was sickness. Sickness was a special time because mother really took care, good care of us. So I remember my baby sister, being put into a drawer to isolate from the rest of us.
Wow.
And if mother wanted to isolate one of us, she'd put two chairs together. And we used to say we were sick of bed on two chairs. And she had solutions for everything, like fried onions to go on your chest. So my sense of storytelling comes out of the family, but not so much the parents, but the siblings.
But also out of women. I mean, you have a very exclusively female-oriented sense of storytelling.
Yes, and I think it does show. But now you use the phrase digital storytelling. So what is that, and how does that work for you? And
well, really, the word, as the British say, it does what it says in the tin. It means storytelling with digital tools, and there's some history to this. Some of the history is pre-digital. We know that whenever humans invent some new communications medium, we invent a way of storytelling with it. So once we invented print, we started writing for print. Once we invented radio, we came up with radio plays and radio theater. With television, we started making serials and soap operas. I mean, long-playing records actually enabled the concept album and storytelling at records. So it's kind of unsurprising that once we started inventing digital technology, digital computers and networks, that we would use them for storytelling. So there's a narrow sense of the term digital storytelling, which dates back to the 90s. A group of theater activists and community activists from San Francisco were really keen on using digital video to tell stories. And they worked for a few years and developed a pedagogy and a curriculum, which is still in place today. They founded a center, which is still here today, called the Center for Digital Storytelling. And it works like this. They take anybody at all, not media geeks, not experts, people of any age, any background, and they teach them enough digital video production to be dangerous, to get the job done, to tell a story. And in 3 days, anybody who goes through this class can produce a roughly 3-minute long digital video. The story is usually a personal one. It can be autobiographical or biographical, describing something that happened to these people in their lives. Could be an immigration story, could be a coming-of-age story, a story about what one does for work. But that whole approach really worked, and it still works to this day. It's remarkable to think about the video technology in the 1990s was quite a bit more challenging than it is now. Nevertheless, they made it work. And it's a very, very powerful approach, and that's still there. I was fascinated by this, and I taught versions of this. And in fact, I worked in academia, so many of the professors and staff that I worked with wanted to tell non-personal stories. Political scientists said, well, I want to talk about the politics of Africa. I don't want to talk about how I got interested in that. I want to present about that. Fine, we developed ways for them to do that. So in that narrow sense, digital storytelling is that Center for Digital Storytelling approach, that personal video story. But I think ever since the 90s, we've invented more and more technologies. And as a result, we've invented new ways of telling stories. So on the one hand, we have social media. So we have blogs, we have Twitter, we have YouTube, we have podcasts, and all those platforms have become venues for telling, sharing, consuming stories. And on the other hand, we have computer gaming, which has become this enormous, enormous culture industry. I mean, a huge cultural facet of human civilization now. And people love to tell stories through games. And on the third hand, we have mobile devices, which give us new ways not only to consume and watch and listen to stories, but also to capture and build the beginnings of stories. You and I, Len, walk around with a Star Trek tricorder or a communicator. We have the ability to capture video, to record audio, to write, and we can even do some editing on this. So now, increasingly, average people have a studio in their pocket that they can use to make stories. So I think that combination of social media, gaming, and mobile devices has created a kind of quiet but broad revolution, giving people the ability to tell stories in new ways. So that's a very long answer to your very short question.
Okay. As you go through all that, do you experience people who have the idea that stories are really not all that necessary, and that they can get by in life without them? And so how do you react to?
Oh, that's a
how do
great
you
question.
deal with people like that?
No, that's a great question. Well, and go back to what I said before. We had a sense of storytelling as personal, and that's a very, very powerful approach. And people love personal stories, and they're not always happy. We have stories about religious conversion. We have stories about trauma. We have stories about life-changing events, which could be for better or for worse, and we really respect those. We give those a special place. We believe in not criticizing people who offer testimony. It's a special rhetorical and cultural spot, and yet we don't necessarily think everything we do meets that. That can seem too therapeutic or too focused on anxiety. It can seem too touchy-feely or too perhaps humanistic. So there's all kinds of room around that where people feel they can communicate without story. But I think a more powerful reason is that through the 20th century, we developed huge, amazing, powerful storytelling platforms that took storytelling out of the hands of everyday people. So if you go back 110 years ago, the dawn of the 20th century, you can think of people telling stories all the time as part of everyday life. I mentioned the American South and its culture of oral storytelling. But also, before we had good recorded music, people would perform music, where you had barbershop quartets. This is why you had so many pianos in family houses, and the seat of the bench of the piano would be filled with music when you open it up. In fact, the biggest way for people to make money was Tin Pan Alley in New York City, where they could make money with sheet music. Sheet music was an industry. So people would learn to play the piano and sing alongside it, and we really owned storytelling in that way. In fact, if you look at radio, the dawn of radio, say 1910 to 1930 or so, you had people making crystal sets, right? You probably did that when you were a kid. And people could make a radio station for their apartment complex or for their block, and you really had storytelling as a democratic, lowercase d, democratic thing. Well, we developed commercial radio. And in the United States, the way we did that was, among other things, to blot out amateur radio with the FCC. We developed Hollywood, which made these tremendous movies, but the capital requirements to make a movie were so great that it was only studios that could afford to do that. Then we developed television, and the same thing happened. And we have print. We have the mass media where, again, you had serious gatekeeping. You had to go through publishers and editors to publish things. And by the middle of the 20th century, storytelling was this beautiful, beautiful artifact that we experienced largely as consumers. You had a very, very small group of people who participated in producing stories. And then as TV went on and as movies went on, you had a small group of fans who would be active and participating. You had science fiction fans who would write journals to each other. In the 1980s, you had the zine scene where people would make magazines, print magazines, and Xerox them and share them around. But again, that was a very, very small percentage. Largely, we had the sense of storytelling, something that we consume. And I think to this day, that media habit is something that we still ingrained in us. I think kids grow up without this because they grow up with the internet, which democratizes media. I don't think I have to make that case. But I think so many people, especially old people and middle-aged people, for whom that's what storytelling is. Storytelling is a DVD that you get from Netflix and you watch. Storytelling is an MP3 file that you might download from iTunes. Storytelling is what you go to the movie theater and watch. Storytelling is not what you necessarily do. And so right now, I mentioned this as a kind of quiet revolution. Part of the revolution is humans discovering anybody could make a story. We all have stories. We all have the capacity to share stories. And that is a huge sea change in our lives right now. So I think that second problem, that second historical change, is a major reason for people not seeing themselves as part of storytelling.
I was thinking about music, and I just want to pick up on that connection. One of the things that my father was always good at was to make sure that we had the music we wanted. The little 45s
Sure.
and the 78s and the 33s,
Yeah.
and particularly Irish music. We lived in a Dutch town, and he was wanting to help us understand our Irish tradition.
Sure.
So he provided all this music, and he went out and bought us a player piano. It wasn't too good, but it worked on the reels that we had. And one of the things that
Wow.
that fostered the storytelling in my family would be the way my four sisters and I would interact with that music, and we played it and sang it,
Yeah.
and so people sang in our household,
Nice.
and that's where the story time came. The other place where the story time came was after the meal, and when we had grown up. I was in junior high school, and we would stay after the meal at the table, and we had this Dutch tradition of drinking coffee, and so there wouldn't be much in the way of dessert, but we would sit around and talk, and that's one time my father would open up, and we'd drink coffee, peanut butter and bread and all that kind of good stuff. And so all that you're saying, it brings back those memories for me.
Was it after dinner?
After dinner,
Yeah.
yes. And that would be, and sometimes during the war, that'd be the only time we'd get together.
So it was World War II.
World War II, yeah, the big one.
So you have a player piano then, in which case it would already have been rare because that's a 19th century invention, but they still lasted for some time. And they're interesting because they are a kind of proto-digital technology where you have the roll that you insert and it fits in. I mean, if you take a look at early IBM punch cards, they work in an eerily similar system. It's just flat rather than round. If you would take a player piano roll and unroll it, it would look like that. Alternating filled and empty spots.
I would never dare in my house.
Oh, I can imagine that.
Be careful with that.
But let me ask: Did you also use radio for that purpose?
We did, although, as you know, Midwestern radio leaves a little to be desired in that era.
But that's part of what I'm describing is if radio failed you in that respect, you were out of luck. You couldn't simply get together a few people and say, hey, let's make an Irish radio station, because that would be, unless you could afford to pay the license fees, which were enormously expensive, the FCC could shut you down, fine you, or even imprison you. Yeah. And that's still true today. So you're out of luck. But at least your father had the gumption to go and get you, recordings.
He did. And finally, eventually that ended up in my sisters saying, we really need to go to Ireland, and we did.
Oh, nice. And you just were there a couple of weeks ago.
We were there a couple of weeks ago for a second trip. But when I asked my sisters where they wanted to go, it turned out that everything we knew about Ireland was from song titles. We didn't know a thing about Ireland except we're going to Galway. Galway Bay.
Did you find
London
Irish
Bay.
eyes that were smiling at you?
Oh, we did, and
that's good.
And
that's
the
good.
Irish musicians were very clear that that's an American song.
Well, it's an interesting. There's always an interesting issue with that, where you look at cultures that we identify as being national, and they actually move back and forth. Where we have lots of you think like Tex-Mex cooking, right? We think about Chinese cooking in America or Italian cooking in America, which mutated and became something else.
Yeah.
But the Irish are people that have always been often migrating and in exile. You know,
Yeah.
we had Irish soldiers fighting in the continent for centuries, right? And of course, you know, since the 1840s, we've had so many Irish in America. You know, that really changes a culture in a lot of ways.
Yeah. When we started this simple process, and this is a community volunteer, you and I have been...
You mean Story Matters?
Story Matters.
Okay.
And we started it basically because there was an opportunity to fill in a spot in a story festival here, and we just called it local storytellers.
Mm-hmm.
And about 12 or 15 people showed up that day. And that's what began the process of gathering for storytelling. And we've been working at that for a while now. And then you and Barbara Ganley came and helped create a broader focus. And we've been working at that too. So we've had some workshops and and those kind of training, and the training that will help enhance the story and the storytelling. And but that initial focus was just to encourage, and still is, just to encourage people to talk and have conversations such as we're having, and tell their story, or try to and find their story, because the story is both important for the past and it's important for the future, because it becomes the basis on which we move forward. I think I've learned two things from this. One is how much we're dependent upon other people for our story. One simple little illustration. My grandmother, years ago, had baked a big cake, and it was good. She had high frosting, and I loved high frosting. And she said, I said, Grandma, and she was not a lady you approached
Casually?
Yeah, right. You had to be careful, you know. And can I have a piece of cake? Another piece of cake? She said, how many have you had? And I suppose I'm reported to have said one, and then under my breath, at a time. I said, now, my once...
You're a serial cake eater.
I would not have that story if my two sisters hadn't remembered it for me and told it over and over. And one of them thought I was clever, and the other thought I was scheming. And they probably carried that over into other things as well, and kind of their assessment of who I am.
Well, stories are reflections, right? You know, on their takes, their perspectives, their interpretations on what someone has done.
Yeah.
You know.
And the other thing I was thinking about in connection to this conversation is how important it is for us to finally find our story. Now, the first thing we say is not necessarily our story, because there's a lot of superficial back and forth storytelling, and I you know, kind of lay one on top of the other. Well, you think that's good, I can top that.
Yeah.
Are not listening. And one thing I've learned is that listening is the first priority for storytelling, not talking. Before you open your mouth, be committed to listening.
At the risk of irony, I'll interrupt you and say that the main logo of the Center for Digital Storytelling is "Listen deeply, tell stories."
Listen deeply, tell.
So that's
stories.
the first sentence is the command: listen deeply.
Yeah, that's helpful, and I hope our folks out there find that very helpful. I think as I was thinking about this, what is my story about my childhood? And the story that stands out is that between 4 and 6, I was shipped off with my father to the railroad yards. My dad was in charge of the distribution of welfare for the county. And so either I would go with him or I would go with one of his drivers. So I spent a lot of time in the railroad yards as all the material that was being distributed
Oh, this wasn't money.
This is food.
Oh.
This
So
was
this is relief.
food, yeah, relief.
Yes.
And so from there, we would go to a CC camp. So I remember, I have some memories of that. And we would go to old folks' homes, and they would show me how they got the old folks out of the building, and they put them on a mattress, and down this tube they would go, with an attendant alongside riding this tube. And the great moment was when they gave me a chance to get on the mattress and go down down this tube.
How old were you then?
I was about 4.
That's
And and only later did I begin to put that story together and see the connections for why the concern about food and hunger and caring for people who do not have what they need is an important thing for me. That's my part of my story.
Yes.
And I didn't know it at the time. It was just a great time to be in the railroad yards and
out
to
of the
visit
railroad
these
yards.
places.
Yeah.
So we wanted to talk about what it is that we learn. What is we can learn if we really pay attention to storytelling? What do you think are some of the things that anyone who is engaging in storytelling
Well, in a sense,
drawn into it?
in a sense, you can divide it into form and content. I mean, the content is you learn a person. You know, I learn about your background and your ethos of care, and how this got you into so many positions and how this shaped your life, right? As an example. You know, me telling you stories about, you know, my time in Bosnia tells you, you know, other things about me. We learn about people. We also learn about community. So working with Story Matters for how many years now? 4 years or so?
More than that.
Well, this teaches me so much about Middlebury town and the surrounding areas in Edison County. You know, all the micro stories teach me about the macro world. And so you learn so much about a community from stories. So there's so much content, but there's also the form. That when you listen to a story, when you watch a story, when you participate in the story, you learn about what makes a story work. You learn about timing, you learn about gestures, you learn about phrases, about repetition, the whole craft of storytelling you get to learn and respond to. So I think those are the two big categories, the two big buckets of learning that we get, is the content, the stuff, the kernel of stories. And then the form, how they work, what we learn from. I mean, even being here, you know, listening to you, watching you, listening to your intonation as you tell a story, your facial expressions, how you hold your body, that's a small lesson in how to effectively tell a story.
And listening to you is really a great help in getting the broad picture. And this is a community effort. We are volunteers.
Entirely.
Entirely. And we just have this interest in well, we use two expressions, I think. When we first started, it's tell us your story.
Right.
Then when we worked with Barbara and with Bryan, it became, let's start a movement. What can we do to start a movement of storytelling? So this is a new venture to help in that direction. So we'd be delighted to have your response, your feedback. We'll be having conversations with a lot of other folks in the weeks and the months to come, all of which would help us focus on why storytelling is a very, very important and critical part of our life.
Well said.
All right. And I think we've come to the end of our time. And thank you, Bryan.
Oh, thank you, Len.
And thank you for the ongoing work that we're doing together.
Thank you for your inspiration.
And all the people who are participating. So,
especially.
And if you want to participate, with the information on this show will be right at the end of this show. And please contact us.